From voter 16 and legal challenges concerning laws that are already passed, to foreign treaties and some worrying revelations about water pollution, this week has been packed with political news. Some of it you probably would have heard, and some of it you might have missed, but that's okay, because this is the Roundup by News of the Week, the show where I, Jake Whitwell, summarise and explain the news, helping you to stay informed. Now that you know what we're covering, and more importantly, what you're watching, let's get on to the news. Now, firstly, the BBC detailed that freeholders have started a legal challenge to renters reform in the High Court. Landowners are challenging LUFRA, or if we're being official here, the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act, which would have reformed property ownership in Britain concerning leasehold and freeholds. The act was squeezed through Parliament last year before the general election by the Conservatives, but was never fully implemented due to complexities in the law, legal challenges and flaws with the legislation. In short, the legislation would have strengthened leaseholders' rights in extending or buying out their freeholds. It would have done this by removing the obligation for leaseholders to pay a marriage value on extending their lease or buying out the freehold. It would also increase the default term that leaseholds are expanded to, and it would ban the issuing of new leaseholds barring certain circumstances. It also made provisions to improve the transparency of the whole process, as well as things like access to information. Landowners and charities who own thousands of properties collectively have said that these changes would infringe upon their rights to private property. It would also hinder their charitable work or their investment in local areas. Many leaseholders that would be empowered by this legislation are also sceptical about it because it's taken over a year to implement. Moving on from property law, the Standard noted that a plan to strip citizenship of extremists during appeals has cleared the Commons. So this concerns the Deprivation of Citizenship Orders Bill, which there's no funny nickname for, unfortunately, and it got through the Commons during its third reading. It will now be scrutinised in the Lords. The bill would mean that people who have their citizenship removed would not have it reinstated until after the appeals process concluded. That would repeal previous legislation, which means that at the moment, someone still has their citizenship while they're appealing. Labour MP Belle Ribeiro Addy shared her concerns, saying that minority communities could be alarmed, and that the bill puts a question mark over people's status as citizens. These sorts of issues with the bill seem to come from the fact that it has a wider scope than under national security concerns and terrorism. Despite many of the arguments in favour of the bill being to tighten up national security and prevent terrorism, it has provisions for things like fraud and other reasons why someone's citizenship might be suspended. Okay, so now moving away from immigration legislation and moving on life and safety, the BBC noted more rules are being considered to keep people safe online. This article relates to the Online Safety Act from 2023, which was also passed from the last government, which is becoming a theme for bills today. It's currently being implemented by Ofcom, and it's been on a running timeline to get this done. So far, the duty of companies to restrict illegal content people can see has come into effect. That came into effect on the 16th of March. The same is true for the duty of companies to improve their accountability and transparency practices. That's a mouthful, which came into effect in December last year. The next part of this process, which is also the most controversial part of this process, is going to come before the 25th of this month, so 5 days from when this episode is released. It requires companies which produce adult content to produce robust age checks, as well as undertake accessibility assessments to limit access for children on their website. This bit is why it's in the news, because despite the legislation being quite wide-ranging, campaigners still have concerns that Ofcom could be doing more under the terms of the legislation that's been passed. That's despite Ofcom saying they would need further legislation to go further, which makes the whole discourse about this a little confusing on the face of it. Now, not only have the Labour Party actually pledged to go further, committing to building on the Tory legislation, recently comments from the Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander basically suggested the government would not wait on going further, and this bill would not be the end of the story on online safety. Reportedly, there are proposals being considered in cabinet, which look like things like a 2-hour cap on individual social media apps and an overall curfew on social media for 10 p.m. The actual technology secretary, Peter Kyle, has said that he wants to tackle the addictive nature of social media apps algorithms as well. Anyway, speaking of children, there's another massive piece of policy come through this week that also concerns them, and that is the lowering of the voting age to 16. It was included in Labour's manifesto on upholding democracy, where they set out pledges like restricting rules for donations, improving voter registration, and extending voter ID, and also extending the right to vote. Until this week, these were just manifesto promises, and they had no real hope of being implemented anytime soon, especially not in this parliamentary session, because it wasn't in the King's speech. What sent the media and the news people into absolute craziness basically over the last few days is Labour publishing a policy paper which outlines why and how they are going to enact this policy. What the paper said was that because 16-year-olds can contribute to society in other ways, they should be allowed to vote. There was also a feeling that it would help build a positive and lifelong sense of participation with the electoral process in this country at a time when people are generally quite apathetic towards politics. In doing this, they also outline measures to keep the registration process quite flush by making sure people could register before their 16th birthday, so if they were newly 16 at the time of election, they could actually vote. Well, that's the main bit that got the press going crazy. There's more too. Labour are also creating an automatic voter registration system, which they say will reduce barriers to voting, which was apparently an issue at the last general election. They've said they will do this with safeguards to make sure people can opt out so that they're not actually infringing on anyone's rights. Because this is also an evolving change, further measures will be put into this policy to allow it to be amended through secondary legislation, which will extend the scope of secondary legislation to amend it without going to the Commons. There are also plans to increase the amount of ID that is accepted as voter IDs at polling stations, even looking at digital ID in the future, and that is amid concerns that there were unfair practices at the last general election over voter ID which were disproportionate to the risk of corruption in this country. That's all the news I got on policy change this week. I'm going to move on to foreign policy now. In news on foreign policy, The Independent detailed that British spies and special forces soldiers details have been exposed in a data breach. So to set the scene, tens of thousands of Afghan people have been put at risk due to an email which contained more information than it should have done, which got out back in 2022. The details of this have only recently been exposed, but that email, which was supposed to contain 150 rows of data, basically contained 33,000. It put thousands of people under threat of exposure from hostile governments, and just like I said, and when you include their family members in Britain, the number jumped up to around 100,000. On top of that, the details of 100 British government personnel, from SAS members to spies and MPs, have all been exposed. And due to the scale of the threat to those people, a super injunction was in place, and it was granted to stop the issue being reported on and getting back to hostile governments like the Taliban. It was kept up with successive judgments that ruled it was providing a function by being in place, and it was protecting these people. However, a report this year undermined those judgments, suggesting that lifting the injunction wouldn't create more of a threat to those people than they already are, as virtue as who they are and their links. The thing is, there's increasing uproar over all the secrecy with this, with now including government officials and not just citizens. Now, in lighter news, The Independent detailed Starmer and Mers have signed the biggest UK-Germany treaty since World War II, and it covers areas like migration, trade and security. The treaty has been called the Kensington Treaty, and it essentially means there will be closer cooperation between the nations on a range of issues. In migration, there will be greater cooperation on law enforcement and over return of illegal migrants. The government has suggested this will act as a deterrent, and Germany will also make people smuggling to the UK a specific offence, which it is currently not at the moment. In defence, there'll be collaboration on a range of schemes, from procuring things like torpedoes and uncrewed aerial systems to the production of a deep precision strike capability, which will be like a world-leading thing. The UK-German Defence Industry Forum, a bit of a mouthful, which is why I'm reading it, will also be developed further to bring the wider industries closer together, and that's in terms of producing armaments and things like that. In science, there'll be cooperation over things like AI, space and battery technology, and outside of that, there will be a new rail network between UK and Germany. UK citizens will also be allowed to use e-gates to enter Germany at some point in the next decade. That concludes the news I got on foreign politics. It was obviously quite short, but there we go. Moving on to general politics then, the BBC detailed the MP's watchdog has found that Rachel Reeves inadvertently broke gifting rules earlier this year. Reeves referred herself to the Standard Commissioner over a breach of parliamentary rules. She had tickets given to her by the National Theatre, which is something she should have declared on the MP's interests register. She had only declared it on the minister's register though. She later described this as an oversight and apologised for her actions in her letter of referral to the Standards Commissioner. The Commissioner said that he had concluded his inquiry on the basis that the failure to declare was inadvertent. Reeves then accepted that and reiterated her apology, and that's pretty much all that was worth reporting on that story. The Guardian reported that Starmer has removed the whip from Rebel MPs. 4 MPs, Rachel Maskell, Neil Duncan Gordon, Brian Lewisham and Chris Hinchcliffe, have lost the party whip for repeatedly rebelling from the government. They had all openly been critical of government policy, from things like the removal of winter fuel payments to some pensioners, the planning bill, or even the latest benefits bill. The move was met with some criticism from within the Labour Party, especially on the left, with some describing the government as brittle and said that it had learnt nothing from the rebellions about listening to the party. One MP basically accused the government of trying to create a climate of fear as other MPs were removed from their trade envoy positions alongside these suspensions. The way these removals basically work means that the MPs are still members of the Labour Party but are not basically in the eyes of Parliament. They don't sit with the Labour Party in Parliament, they sit as independent. In most cases though, and in these cases, they do retain their membership to the party, so they technically belong to Labour, just not in Parliament, not in the Commons. Well, apparently the government is doing some sort of clear out because the Times reported that Labour has suspended Diane Abbott for repeating controversial comments on race. Abbott wrote a letter to The Observer in 2023 where she wrote that Irish traveller and Jewish people experienced prejudice that was similar to racism. She also said that while white people with points of difference can experience prejudice, they are not all their lives subjected to racism. At the time, she was suspended from the party over those remarks as Labour was trying to shake off an alleged history of anti-Semitism. She also said they were published in error. However, this week she was asked if she regretted her comments and she said no. Further to that, she said there's clearly a difference between racism that is over colour and over other types of prejudice. She used the example of walking down a street where if you come across a white person, you wouldn't be able to tell if they were Jewish, Irish or a traveller, but if you were walking down the street you would see a black person and you'd recognise that they're black. And I'm not going to pass comment on that, but you can make your own judgment as to the validity of her comments there. All that matters really though for this is that she has been suspended for a second time over these comments. Anyway, that concludes the news I got on general politics. I'll move on to stats and trends now. In news and stats and trends, The Guardian reported the UK is a power keg of social tension a year on from the riots last summer, and that's according to a report. The think tank British Future and the Belong Together network found that there was a risk of unrest being reignited unless the government took action to address issues like polarisation and division. The research found that 31% of adults said they had never or rarely had a chance to interact with people of other cultures. A third said they didn't even interact with people in their local community. The report was based on evidence of 177 organisations working on the issue, 113 submissions of evidence similar to the issue, survey results and focus groups which are all representative of different people in this country. In a foreword to the report, Sajid Javid and John Cruddas said that the bonds that hold society together, like civic partnership and a shared sense of identity, are being put under pressure. They said this pressure leaves society particularly at risk and more fragmented and less resilient to threat. The report was clear that the recent events from the Southport attack to riots in Northern Ireland and the grooming gang scandal make these weaknesses clear, or in their words, laid them to bare. Now, the Guardian had a second article in this section of the episode that they reported that the Prevent scheme missed chances to intervene with the David Amies and Southport. The Anderson report, named after Lord Anderson, who reviews Prevent, basically said it suffered from a string of failings which led to it failing to de-radicalise David Amies' killer. It detailed he was declared a non-risk after only one meeting when he should have had 7. These failures weren't always consistent with the normal running of Prevent, but there were some issues with poor judgment, poor communication, and then some officials suffered a lack of follow-through in their decisions. Its failings in the Radicabana case, when it wasn't as sufficiently concerned with his violent tendencies, because there was no evidence it was driven by ideology. The report then recommended an expansion to Prevent to include a mandate to go after individuals who were maybe fascinated with violence or mass casualty events but were not linked to a specific ideology. Surprise, surprise, the Guardian featured again. It reported unemployment has risen and growth has slowed while the job market has weakened. The ONS, the Office of National Statistics, showed Britain's unemployment has risen to 4.7%, up 0.1 from its rise in April, and is at its highest level since 2021. Meanwhile, the economy contracted in May, as covered in last week's episode. That was following a contraction in April, although those two follow and are sort of levelled out by a rise in the months prior to that. To round off the stats covered in the Guardian's headline, in this one, not the other two, the job vacancies fell by 727,000 in June, making it the 36th consecutive month of decline, and that is 3 years overall. There is speculation that this will lead to interest rates not being cut as they are expected to when the Bank of England reviews them, and that can have a knock-on effect on inflation, which is already increasing. Not cutting the rates can also have bad ramifications for both growth and borrowing. BBC News detailed that the Environment Agency has found that serious water pollution events have risen by up to 60% in England. They mean up to 60% across the year, although not that this is actually a good stat. In total, there were 2,801 incidents in 2024, which is the highest on record. 75 of these were considered to have serious harm to fisheries or human health. What's worse is that just 3 companies were responsible for most of these serious incidents. Thames Water, coveting the unwanted prize of first place, had 33 incidents, while Southern Water had 15 and Yorkshire Water had 13. The Public Accounts Committee, which I don't think has much to do with the provision of water, said the levels were woeful. In any case, these stats come ahead of a report, which is coming out tomorrow as I'm recording this, into the water companies. Ahead of that report, the government has also set out a pledge to cut sewage pollution by 2030. That is the first time the government has ever put a pledge to this policy. For what it's worth, in terms of delivering on that pledge, the government has already invested £189 million into supporting hundreds of enforcement officers being hired to enhance inspections and prosecutions for serious spillages. That money will be funded by fines from water companies, and the government is also seemingly working with devolved governments to do things like ban harmful plastic baby wipes and set an overflow discharge reduction plan. That's all for this week of the Roundup. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helped you make more sense of what's happening in politics this week. If you found it useful, please consider subscribing or following along and liking this video. I'll be taking a short break next week where there won't be an episode of the Roundup released, but I'll be back to explain the political news clearly the week after next. Bye!